If you're into Neo-Tantra or the occult, you're going to hear people talking about the left and right hand paths. If you're a Buddhist, they talk about the Great Middle Path. If you're a Taoist, they talk about the Great Way or the Great Path. And if you're into esoteric Kung Fu systems, they talk about a no-handed path. Welcome to another episode of SHA-Mansplaining. My name's Matt, and today we're going to travel some of these pathways. So, starting at the start, people mainly talk about the left and the right hand paths. There's a little bit of confusion around what left and right means amongst the different groups or traditions, but essentially these terms were taken from Tantra, ancient Buddhist and Hindu esotericism, and then they were innovated upon and changed a little bit. The left originates with the Sanskrit term Vamachara, and it literally means left-handed attainment. This path denotes the more extreme practices that upset the status quo of traditional Vedic spiritualism. The other path, Dakshinachara, translates directly as right-handed path, and it's derived from the word Dakshina. And this is a kind of customary Hindu law or a community norm, and it's characterized by the qualities of goodness, truth, balance, and peacefulness and virtuousness. So you've most likely heard more people talk about the other one, the left-hand path, because let's face it, naughty things are often more popular with people, and if you can bullshit your way into being hedonistic but telling everyone that you're on a spiritual pathway, then it's a win-win for you, I guess. So fans of that interpretation reference some extreme sects of Shiva worship, and one of these was the Kapalika, or skull men, so named because they carried a skull-topped trident and an empty skull as a begging bowl. They were social outcasts because they had committed the ultimate sin of killing a Brahmin, and they were punished by having to carry the Brahmin's skull around, and they were spiritually outcast as penance for their crimes. They were known to drink alcohol, sex fluids, and eat meat freely. They meditated upon rotting corpses and smeared their bodies with the ashes from funeral pyres, all extremely taboo things for the Orthodox Hindus. Now, we don't actually know much about them, but scholars think that this tradition eventually gave rise to more refined versions of the left-handed sects, such as Kaula. In Hinduism, this left-handed attainment is sometimes associated with the 5 M's. These are 5 words that all begin with M in Sanskrit, and they translate to wine, meat, fish, cereal, and sexual intercourse. Now, although that sounds like an absolutely charming dinner party, the 5 M's is a little bit more complicated than that. And it's much more complicated, the left-hand path is more complicated than simply saying, well, it's just hedonic and sinful and dark. So if you examine it, the Vamachara traditions actually placed strict ritual limits on the use of the 5 M's, and they never really encouraged overindulgence in those things. They were to be used as a spiritual tool, I guess you could say. So practitioners could even make symbolic substitutions for any one of the 5 M's, or even all of them. And the appeal here is that right-handers could engage in these tantric or left-hand practices without actually partaking in any one of the substances or sex, for example. And it's rumored that numerous Orthodox saints actually engaged in this practice. Further to this, the 5 M's can be interpreted in very crude base terms, or they could be interpreted in very refined esoteric or occult terms. So for example, one of the 5 M's, Mathuna, is in simply the act of sex. In a more occult understanding, it could allude to the union of complementary diametric forces. You know, think yin and yang embodied in a man and a woman having sex together. So it wasn't necessarily just about fucking. And the other substances weren't just about drinking wine, but perhaps you would meditate on drinking a heavenly or divine substance as you took the wine. Very much like the taking the blood of Christ in the Christian tradition, for example. So, as usual, tantric literature and tantric practices were always cloaked in varied and complex layers of meaning, and you had to be initiated into those cults or into those sects and trained to understand the symbolic meanings. You weren't just feasting on the 5Ms all the time, contrary to what some neo-spiritualists might claim today. So occult language and occult practices are always quite hidden, and that's the definition of occult. And the meanings were very complex and layered. Speaking of the occult, this brings us to the Western occultists, or practitioners of magic as they're known. So they've got their own interpretations of the paths. Generally speaking, the left indicates black magic and the right indicates white magic. Although, forgive me, that's a very oversimplified summary. But generally speaking, the right rejects anything regarded as evil or dark, things that Carl Jung referred to as the shadow. And this is where New Agers got the phrase shadow work from. So to do the shadow work is to engage in the not so nice aspects or the more evil or dark aspects of your personality so that you could integrate them. The left-handers see the right-hand path as kind of just one step along a much further road. Their goal is non-duality, the realization that all paths ultimately head to the same divine destination, and that there is no good and evil. Good and evil is simply constructs of the human imagination. So generally speaking, left-handers often reject societal convention and the status quo in a search for spiritual freedom. As a part of this, followers of the left-hand path denounce the guru and authoritarian relationship structures, and they embrace magical techniques that would be traditionally viewed as taboo. For instance, using sex magic or embracing satanic imagery, for example. Questioning religious and moral dogma and openly embracing sex and sexuality was a huge part of the counterculture revolutions in the 60s and 70s. And this is why it was later, these ideas were folded into society at that time and folded into the Western cult of sacred sex, which has now become known as Neo-Tantra. So there you have a basic rundown of where these concepts came from and how they came to the West. But we're going to go back to the East for a little bit now and talk about some of the lesser known paths, because there are some amazing pathways that come from the ancient Chinese mystics or Taoists. Now the Taoist left-hand path is the most safest, the most recommended, and it's referred to as dual cultivation, the practice of using sex with a partner as a meditative bridge to higher planes of consciousness. Unlike strict Hindu orthodoxy, sex with a partner is not considered a hindrance but a help. It's a boon to your spiritual development. The Taoist right-hand path of celibacy is not for beginners or those of weak will, and it was generally not recommended. That's because the mind can be poisoned by unexpressed sexual energy, as we have seen with the most heinous and awful examples of some Catholic priests. Anyway, the Taoists didn't really care about which path you used. Right, left, no-handed. They weren't really interested in getting into morality arguments over sex. They simply preferred to cultivate energy using all of the day-to-day tools that they had at their disposal. At the highest levels of energy cultivation and transformation, there is a path that is neither left nor right, called the no-handed path. And the no-hand path is the most refined, and it involves transcendental states of being that go well above and beyond the mere act of having sex. So with the Taoist tradition, you could say that they start with the left, then take the right, and eventually have no need for pathways, because merging with the great path, or the great way, the Tao, is the realization that there can be no pathway to somewhere if you are already everywhere. If you're interested in learning the left-hand path of the Taoists and using sex as a bridge to higher planes of masculinity and consciousness, then please check out SHA-Man.com. Please comment on this video if you like it. Hit the button and share it. Stay tuned for more episodes of SHA-Mansplaining, and whatever path you're on, I really hope that you're enjoying the journey.